At 6 a.m., the knock didn't sound urgent. It sounded final. Not the kind that asks if you're home, the kind that tells you your life is about to be rearranged by someone else. When I opened the door, a deputy sheriff stood on my porch with an eviction order in his hand. Calm, professional, certain. I remember thinking there had to be a mistake, because this was my house. The house my grandfather left me. The house I paid for, repaired, and slept in every night. Then I looked down at the paperwork, and my stomach went cold. The eviction wasn't filed by a bank. It wasn't filed by a stranger. It was filed by the two people standing across the street watching in silence. My parents. That was the moment I understood this wasn't about a house. It was about how easily someone can erase you if they get to the paperwork first. At 6 a.m., the knock didn't come with urgency. It came with certainty. I woke before the sound fully reached my brain, heart already racing, the room still dark and quiet in the way only early morning can be. For a second, I thought I'd imagined it. Then it came again. Slow, deliberate, metal against wood. Not the knock of a neighbor. Not a delivery. The kind of knock that assumes you'll open the door because it was never meant to ask. I sat up in bed and checked the clock. 6 a.m. exactly. Outside, the sky was a dull gray, just beginning to shift. I pulled on a sweater and moved down the hallway without turning on the lights, stepping carefully where the floor creaked least. Old habit. Old house. My grandfather taught me that. He taught me most things that mattered. When I reached the front door, the knock came again, followed by a calm male voice. Sheriff's office. My hands went cold. I didn't rush. Panic makes you sloppy, and sloppiness becomes a version of you other people are too eager to believe. I flipped on the porch light and leaned toward the peephole. A deputy sheriff stood on my porch, tan uniform pressed, black vest snug across his chest. One hand held a clipboard thick with papers. His patrol car sat at the curb with its lights off, as if he'd made a choice not to wake the whole street. I opened the door with the chain still on. "Ma'am," he said, glancing at the paperwork. "Are you Claire Holloway?" "Yes. I'm Deputy Blake with the county sheriff's office," he said. "I'm here regarding a writ of possession." The words didn't hit all at once. They arrived in pieces, sharp and separate. Writ, possession. "There has to be a mistake," I said. "This is my house." Deputy Blake didn't react. He didn't argue either. He simply lifted the top page slightly and angled it so I could see without stepping outside. My name was printed there in clean black letters. "I'm not here to determine ownership," he said. "I'm here to execute a court order." That's when I saw them. Across the street, near the mailbox at the corner, two figures stood half in shadow. My mother's arms were folded, her posture composed, as if she were waiting for something she expected to happen. My father stood beside her with his hands in his coat pockets, staring straight ahead. They weren't surprised. Something inside me went very still. "Who filed this?" I asked. Deputy Blake hesitated, just long enough for me to know the answer mattered. He looked back down at the paperwork, then up at me again. "It was filed by Marianne Holloway and Thomas Holloway," he said. "My parents." My mother lifted her chin slightly across the street, almost proud. My father didn't move at all. The cold in my chest spread outward, steady and precise. "When was this entered?" I asked. "Judgment was entered last week," Deputy Blake replied. "Last week. I'd been here last week. I'd gone to work, come home, watered the plants, slept in my bed. No notices, no papers taped to the door, no certified mail. I was never served," I said. "Where was I served?" He scanned the page again. Service address listed as 118 Northridge Drive. That wasn't my address. It hadn't been my address in over a decade. It was the small rental my parents lived in years ago, before they moved. A place I hadn't stepped foot in since high school. "That's not where I live," I said. "It's what's on the return of service," he replied carefully. From across the street, my mother called out, loud enough to carry. "We tried to handle this privately, Claire," my father added, his voice flat. "You left us no choice." I didn't look at them. I looked at the deputy. "Can you show me the return of service?" I asked. He flipped the page back and angled it toward me. A single line stood out immediately. "Substitute service accepted by adult female occupant." My stomach tightened. Adult female occupant. There was no confusion about who that was. In that moment, I understood what this really was. This wasn't just an eviction. It was a rush. A squeeze. A plan designed to force me out before I could think. Before I could gather anything that proved I belonged here. Because if I didn't stop this, a deputy sheriff would legally remove me from the house my grandfather left me. Before noon. "Do you have somewhere you can go?" Deputy Blake asked. Not unkind. Procedural. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "Not yet." He nodded once, like he respected the answer even if he couldn't honor it. "I need to tell you," he said quietly. "This writ authorizes same-day possession." Same day. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I asked him to hold the paperwork steady while I took clear photos of every page, the case number, the court seal, the service address. Then I stepped back inside, closed the door gently, and slid the deadbolt into place. It wouldn't stop what was coming, but it gave me something far more important. Time to build a record. The door clicked shut behind me with a sound that felt too small for what it was holding back. I stood there for a moment, hand still on the deadbolt, listening to the quiet inside the house and the distant murmur of voices outside. My parents were talking now. Low, controlled, the way people speak when they believe the outcome is already decided. I didn't give them the satisfaction of watching me hesitate. I moved quickly, but carefully. Speed without focus is just panic with better posture. I went straight to the kitchen drawer where I kept the fireproof pouch and pulled it out, setting it on the table like a piece of equipment. Deed copy, probate distribution letter, property tax statements, insurance policy, the documents my grandfather once called the boring proof that keeps liars honest. I lined them up, smoothing the edges, forcing my hands to stay steady. Through the front window, I could still see my parents across the street. They hadn't moved closer. They didn't need to. From where they stood, the law was already doing the walking for them. My phone buzzed as I dialed the courthouse. "Civil Division," a woman answered, her voice brisk and flat, like someone who had already taken too many calls that morning. "I have a writ of possession being executed today," I said. I kept my tone level. "I was never served. I need to file an emergency motion to stay enforcement and vacate the default judgment." There was a pause. The faint sound of keys tapping. The kind of pause where you can almost hear someone deciding whether to follow the script or step slightly off it. "What's the case number?" she asked. I read it from the photo I'd taken at the door, more typing, longer this time. "This is an unlawful detainer filed by Marianne and Thomas Holloway," she said. "Default judgment entered last week." "I was never served," I repeated. "The service address is wrong." Another pause. "It says substitute service accepted by an adult female occupant." "That would be my mother," I said. Saying it out loud made it feel heavier, more deliberate. "At an address I don't live at." Her voice shifted. Just enough. "You need to come to the courthouse as soon as we open. Bring proof of your current address and proof of ownership. You'll need to file an emergency stay." "What happens if I don't?" I asked. She exhaled quietly. "If the writ is executed, it becomes harder. Harder. The word courts use when they mean devastating." "I'm on my way," I said, and ended the call. I opened the front door again, leaving the chain on. Deputy Blake was still there, standing exactly where he'd been before, patient in the way only people doing their jobs can afford to be. "I'm going to the courthouse," I told him. "I'm filing an emergency stay." "That's what you need to do," he said, then lowering his voice. "If you get it, call our civil unit immediately." "Can you give me the number?" I asked. He hesitated, glanced toward my parents, then wrote it on a card and slid it through the gap. "I can't give legal advice," he said, "but I can tell you where to send the order." Across the street, my father finally raised his voice. "Pack your things, Claire. Don't make this ugly." I met his eyes for the first time. "You made it ugly when you lied to a judge." My mother smiled, tight, controlled. like she'd practiced it. You can file whatever you want. It's already done. I closed the door without responding. I didn't leave through the front. I went out the back, cut along the fence, and reached my car without having to pass them. As I drove away, the street looked unchanged. Same houses, same trees, same quiet. It was unsettling how little the world reacted to a life being dismantled. At the courthouse, the doors opened to fluorescent light and the smell of disinfectant. I was through security before most people had finished adjusting their coats. When I set the paperwork on the tray and said, "I have an eviction being executed today," the guard waved me through without a word. Upstairs, the civil division counter was already forming a line. People stood clutching folders, eyes down, as if looking too closely at anyone else's paperwork might make their own worse. When it was my turn, I slid my ID and the photos across the counter. "I need an emergency stay and a motion to vacate," I said. I was never served. The clerk typed, frowned, then turned his monitor slightly so I could see. The proof of service appeared on the screen. My stomach tightened as I read the signature line. "Marianne Holloway." "She signed for it," I said quietly. "She's the plaintiff." The clerk's eyebrows lifted a fraction. He printed the page and slid it under the glass. "Highlight that," he said. "It matters." I handed him the deed copy and the probate letter. He scanned them, then clicked again. Faster now. "Your parents filed this as landlords," he said. "They're claiming you're a tenant holding over." "A tenant?" I repeated. He pulled up another exhibit. A one-page rental agreement. My name typed neatly at the top. Their names listed as landlords. And at the bottom, a signature that looked like someone had tried to remember mine and given up halfway through. "They forged it," I said. He didn't comment. Clerks rarely do. Instead, he handed me a thick packet. "If you want the judge to see this today," he said, "file your emergency motion now. Department 12. I took the packet, found a bench, and began filling it out with slow, deliberate handwriting. Wrong address. Plaintiff accepted service. Forged lease. Recorded ownership in my name. When I slid the packet under the assistant's window, she read the first page, then the second, then stopped. "You're saying the plaintiff accepted service on behalf of the defendant?" she asked. "Yes," I said. She disappeared through the door without another word. I sat back on the bench, hands folded, breathing steady, knowing that somewhere the clock was still moving toward noon. The hallway outside Department 12 was narrow and overly bright, the kind of brightness that makes everything feel exposed. I sat on the wooden bench with my hands folded in my lap, my packet resting beside me like something alive. Every few minutes, someone walked past. Attorneys murmuring into phones, clerks carrying stacks of files, but no one looked at me long enough to ask why I was there alone. The assistant returned without warning. She didn't sit. She didn't smile. She leaned slightly toward the counter and lowered her voice. "Judge Watkins will see you," she said, "but there's something you need to know first." My stomach tightened. I nodded. "There's another exhibit attached to your parents' filing," she continued. "It wasn't part of the eviction paperwork you were served with." "What exhibit?" I asked. "A quitclaim deed," she said. "Recorded 2 weeks ago. It claims the property was transferred back to your parents." For a moment, the hallway noise fell away, replaced by a thin ringing in my ears. A deed wasn't just another document. A deed rewrote ownership. It rewrote the story. "I didn't sign anything," I said. She watched my face carefully, not for panic, but for clarity. "You'll have a chance to address it," she said. "I wanted you prepared." Prepared. I thanked her because that's what you do when someone gives you bad news without cruelty. Then I followed her into the courtroom. It was smaller than I expected. Dimmer. Built for efficiency, not comfort. A few people sat scattered across the benches, their conversations stopping when the bailiff called the case number. My parents were already there. They sat near the front with their attorney between them, close enough to look united. My mother wore a soft cardigan and a concerned expression, like she'd come to rescue me from myself. My father stared straight ahead, jaw tight, hands folded. They looked calm, ready. Judge Eleanor Watkins took the bench and glanced down at the file. Her mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. "Good morning," she said. "We're here on an emergency motion to stay enforcement of a writ of possession." "Ms. Holloway, you're the defendant?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And you're appearing without counsel?" "Yes." She turned to the other table. "Counsel?" "Richard Cole for the plaintiffs," the attorney replied smoothly. Judge Watkins nodded once and looked back at me. "Ms. Holloway, you understand the writ authorizes same-day possession." "Yes," I said. "By noon." She didn't react to the urgency. Judges don't respond to fear. "Tell me why I should issue a stay." I stepped forward and slid my packet across the clerk's desk. "I was never properly served. The proof of service shows the plaintiff accepted substitute service at an address I do not live at." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "The plaintiff signed the service form?" "Yes." Mr. Cole stood. "Your Honor, substitute service is permitted under statute." "Don't recite statute," Judge Watkins said. "Answer the question. Did your client sign as the adult occupant who accepted service?" There was a pause, short but revealing. "Yes," Mr. Cole said, "at what we believe to be the defendant's last known address." Judge Watkins turned to me. "Is that your last known address?" "No," I said. "I have not lived there as an adult." I handed over my ID and a recent utility bill. She scanned them, then looked directly at my mother. "Mrs. Holloway," she said, "why did you accept service on behalf of the defendant at an address that is not her residence?" My mother folded her hands. "Your Honor, we were concerned." Claire had stopped responding. "We were trying to protect the property." "That's not an answer," Judge Watkins said calmly. "You either knew where she lived or you didn't." My father leaned forward. "She's been unstable," he said. "We didn't know what else to do." The word hung there. Unstable, heavy, and strategic. Judge Watkins didn't react to it. "Protect it from whom?" she asked. Silence. Mr. Cole tried again. "Your Honor, the plaintiffs own the home. They had to recover possession." Judge Watkins picked up a page from the file. "I've reviewed the exhibits," she said. "One of them is a deed." She held it up slightly. "Exhibit C is a recorded quitclaim deed purporting to transfer the property from Claire Holloway to Mary Ann and Thomas Holloway 2 weeks ago." My pulse surged. I held it down. "Ms. Holloway," she asked me, "did you sign a quitclaim deed transferring this property to your parents?" "No," I said. "I did not." Mr. Cole opened his mouth. Judge Watkins raised a hand. "You're alleging this deed is fraudulent," she said to me. "Yes, Your Honor, and I can prove I was not present for any notarization." Her pen paused. "How?" "I was at work all day," I said. "My employer has badge access logs and parking gate records, time-stamped." The room shifted, not loudly, but decisively. Judge Watkins leaned back slightly. "I am not comfortable enforcing a writ of possession on this record," she said. Mr. Cole began to speak. She stopped him with a glance. "I'm issuing an emergency stay," she said. "Effective immediately. Enforcement is suspended pending a hearing on the motion to vacate default and further review of the deed." The words landed like oxygen. She looked directly at my parents. "If this deed is fraudulent," she said, "this court will address it." I exhaled slowly, carefully. Outside the courtroom, somewhere beyond the walls, the clock was still moving towards noon. But for the first time that morning, it wasn't running ahead of me. The hearing ended without ceremony. No gavel strike, no raised voices, just the clerk announcing the next case and the quiet shuffle of people standing up, as if what had just happened were ordinary. It didn't feel ordinary to me. It felt like standing on a narrow ledge with a sudden inch of space added beneath my feet. Judge Watkins's clerk handed me a copy of the signed order. "Emergency stay granted." The words were clean, formal, temporary. I read them twice to make sure they didn't disappear. My parents didn't look at me as they gathered their things. Their attorney leaned in to speak to them, his voice low and tight. Whatever confidence they'd walked in with had thinned, but it hadn't vanished. Not yet. I didn't wait to see what they'd do next. Momentum mattered. I left the courtroom and walked straight down the hall, my steps measured, my grip firm on the folder tucked against my chest. In the stairwell, I pulled out my phone and called the number Deputy Blake had given me earlier. "Sheriff's Civil Unit," a dispatcher answered. "My name is Claire Holloway," I said. "I have an emergency stay order issued this morning. I need to confirm enforcement is suspended." There was a pause, then typing. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "We have it. The writ is on hold." "Thank you," I replied, and ended the call before relief could soften my voice. Outside, the courthouse steps were already busy with people who had no idea what almost happened inside. Sunlight bounced off the stone like nothing had been at risk. I stood there for one steady breath, then headed for my car. The stay had bought me time. But time only works if you spend it before someone else does. I drove straight to the county recorder's office. The waiting room smelled faintly of paper and old air. People sat with envelopes on their laps, eyes forward, as if the room itself demanded restraint. I took a number and waited, replaying the assistant's words in my head. A deed. 2 weeks ago. Long enough to plan. Long enough to think no one would notice. When my number was called, I stepped to the counter and slid my ID across with 2 documents. My grandfather's probate distribution deed and the quitclaim deed my parents had filed. "I need to place a fraud alert on my property record," I said. "A judge issued a stay today and referred this deed for further review." The clerk typed, her eyes narrowing slightly as she read. "This quitclaim was recorded in person," she said. 2 weeks ago." "I didn't sign it," I replied. "And I wasn't present for any notarization." She nodded once. Not agreement, but acknowledgement, and printed a form. "This won't invalidate the deed," she said, "but it will flag the parcel. Anyone who pulls the record will see the dispute." That was the point. I signed the form slowly, deliberately, using my normal signature. The clerk stamped it and added it to the file. As she slid the receipt toward me, she hesitated. "Can I show you something?" she asked. "Yes." She turned the monitor slightly. The notary block on the quitclaim deed filled the screen. One digit in the commission number had been crossed out and rewritten. Small. Easy to miss. Impossible to justify. "That correction should have triggered a rejection," she said quietly. But it didn't. My jaw tightened. Not with fear, but focus. "Can you print that image?" I asked. "And the intake notes." She nodded and handed me the pages moments later, warm from the printer and heavy with implication. Evidence doesn't need drama, it needs clarity. When I got home, my parents' car was parked across the street. They didn't get out. They didn't wave. They just sat there, watching, as if proximity alone might bend something back in their favor. I didn't look at them. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and locked it again behind me. The house felt different. Not threatened, but alert. I set the recorder's receipt and the printed images on the kitchen table and took a photo of them with the date visible on my phone. Then I made the call I'd been holding back. "Security," a man answered. "This is Claire Holloway," I said. "I need badge access logs from 2 weeks ago, specifically the entire day of the 13th. There was a pause. "What's the reason?" "A deed was filed claiming I signed it in front of a notary that day," I said. "I need to document where I was." The tone shifted immediately. "Understood," he said. "We'll pull badge entries, parking gate logs, and preserve camera footage if available." "Thank you," I said. When the call ended, the doorbell rang. I didn't move toward it. I moved toward my phone and opened the camera app, letting it record the sound and the time before I spoke. "Claire," my mother called through the door, "we need to talk." "No," I replied, "we don't." "You're taking this too far," my father said, his voice low and controlled. "You took it to court," I said evenly. "Communication goes through attorneys now." Silence followed, then footsteps retreating. A car door closing. Later that evening, an email arrived from my employer's security office. Logs attached, footage preserved. I stacked the documents neatly, one on top of the other, like bricks set into place. If you rush me, I thought, I will slow down. If you lie on paper, I will read it closer. By the time the sky darkened outside my windows, the house felt steadier than it had all day. The stay had stopped the clock. The record was growing. And for the first time since dawn, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was building. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was afraid to be in the house, but because my mind refused to slow down. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw paper. Signatures, dates, boxes checked by people who assumed no one would ever question them. Around midnight, I stopped trying. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and spread everything out again. Order calms me, not emotionally, logically. I laid the documents in sequence. The eviction filing, the proof of service with my mother's signature, the forged lease, the quitclaim deed, the recorder's receipt with the fraud alert, the image of the notary commission number that had been crossed out and rewritten. Each page told a piece of the story. Together, they told one version only. This hadn't been panic or impulse. It had been planned. Just after dawn, my phone vibrated. Unknown number. I stared at it until it stopped ringing. A minute later, a text appeared. You don't understand what you've started. I took a screenshot, saved it to a folder labeled with the case number, and forwarded it to myself with a subject line that said exactly what it was: post-stay contact. Then I silenced the phone and poured another cup of coffee. At the courthouse later that morning, the atmosphere felt different. Quieter. More alert. The building hadn't changed, but the people inside it had. Clerks glanced longer at filings. Security guards watched who went where. Systems do that when something doesn't add up. They begin to look for the edges. In the hallway outside Department 12, my parents were already there with their attorney. My mother wore a different cardigan than the day before, softer in color, like she believed tone could rewrite facts. My father stood with his arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes fixed straight ahead. And behind them, sitting a little too stiffly, was a woman I hadn't seen before. She held a large purse against her chest with both hands. The notary. She didn't look smug. She didn't look confident. She looked like someone who had been told to show up and repeat a sentence without understanding how many ways it could collapse. When her eyes met mine, they slid away immediately. The bailiff called the case. We stood. Judge Watkins took the bench and went straight to the point. We're here on the defendant's motion to vacate default, she said, and the court's concerns regarding a recorded quitclaim deed. She turned to my parents' attorney. Counsel, do you have the original deed? Yes, Your Honor, he replied, holding up a manila envelope. Judge Watkins nodded, then shifted her gaze to the woman behind him. Mr. Sloan, she said, you are a commissioned notary public in this state? Yes, the woman answered. Her voice was thin, carefully controlled. And you notarized a deed transferring property from Claire Holloway to Marianne and Thomas Holloway on the 13th. The judge continued. Yes, then you will produce your notary journal. The attorney stood too quickly. Your Honor, the acknowledgement is complete. The journal isn't necessary. Judge Watkins didn't raise her voice. Sit down. He sat. Mr. Sloane's hands shook as she opened her purse and pulled out a small black book. The bailiff carried it to the bench. The courtroom went quiet in that way that makes every movement sound louder than it should. Judge Watkins flipped through the pages, then stopped. Ms. Sloane, she said evenly, what identification did you verify for Claire Holloway on the 13th? A driver's license, the notary replied. The judge looked down again. Your journal lists a license number ending in 931. She lifted her eyes to me. Ms. Holloway, what are the last 3 digits of your license? 617, I said, without hesitation. Judge Watkins nodded once and returned her attention to the notary. Explain the discrepancy. Mrs. Sloane's eyes flicked, just once, toward my parents. Judge Watkins didn't miss it. Did you witness Claire Holloway sign this deed in your presence? The judge asked. Yes, the notary said too quickly. I stepped forward and slid the badge logs across the clerk's desk. Your Honor, I said, These show I was inside a secured building from 8 a.m. to after 6 p.m. on the 13th. Here are the parking gate records and the security certification. Judge Watkins reviewed the timestamps, her expression tightening. The journal lists the notarization time as 12:15, she said. She looked back at Mrs. Sloane. The defendant's logs place her inside a controlled facility at that time. She did not leave. The notary swallowed. Maybe it was later. Judge Watkins turned another page. No, she said calmly. It was not. The attorney stood again. Your Honor, journals can contain clerical errors. Enough, Judge Watkins said. She leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Sloane, are you familiar with the consequences of notarizing a signature you did not witness? Yes, the notary whispered. I'm going to ask you one last time, the judge said. Did you witness Claire Holloway sign this deed? Silence stretched. My mother's fingers curled into the fabric of her sleeve. My father stared straight ahead. No, Mrs. Sloane said finally. I didn't. The room didn't erupt. It simply reset, like something heavy had finally been set down. Judge Watkins straightened. Thank you, she said. That will be all. She turned to my parents. This court is vacating the default judgment. The writ of possession is dissolved. The unlawful detainer is dismissed for lack of proper service and lack of standing. My mother inhaled sharply. My father finally looked at me. This court is referring the quitclaim deed for investigation of fraudulent conveyance, the judge continued, and the notary to the commissioning authority. She looked at me last. Ms. Holloway, obtain certified copies of today's order and record them immediately. I nodded once. Outside the courtroom, no one followed me. Some losses are too loud to chase. I went straight to the clerk's office, then the recorder, letting the paper trail close behind me like a door that finally knew how to lock. By the time I drove home, the street was quiet. The house stood exactly where it always had, but the lie that tried to take it was finished. The house felt different after the ruling. Not lighter, not safer, but alert. Like it had been listening and finally heard something it recognized as true. I locked the door behind me, set my keys on the counter, and stood still for a moment, letting the silence settle without trying to interpret it. The first thing I did was change the locks. Not out of fear, out of clarity. The locksmith arrived within an hour, efficient and uninterested in the backstory. He worked quickly, replaced the front and back cylinders, tested them twice, and handed me 2 new keys. When he left, the sound of the door closing landed differently than it had that morning. Solid. Final. Access removed. I laid the certified copies of the judge's order on the kitchen table and photographed them with the date visible. Then I slid them into the fireproof pouch alongside the deed, the badge logs, and the recorder's fraud alert receipt. I made 2 duplicate sets. One went into a locked drawer, the other into the trunk of my car. Redundancy isn't paranoia. It's what you do when you've learned how fragile assumptions are. By early evening, the messages started. An email from my mother, subject line blank. We never meant for it to go this far. We were trying to protect the family. You didn't have to embarrass us. I read it once, then again more slowly. Not to feel it, to place it. The language was familiar. Protection, family, embarrassment. None of it acknowledged the forged papers, the false service, the attempted eviction. None of it took responsibility. I archived the email, forwarded it to myself, labeled it post-ruling contact. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. My father's voice filled the room when I played it back. Low, controlled. This doesn't end the way you think it does, he said. You're forcing us to protect ourselves now. Protect, again. I saved the voicemail. No reply. Replies create threads. Threads invite explanations. I wasn't explaining anything anymore. That night, I slept for 3 uninterrupted hours. When I woke, it wasn't from a sound. It was from the absence of one. No knocking. No engines idling outside. No movement across the street pretending to be coincidence. In the morning, I went to work. Normalcy is its own kind of record. My badge beeped at the gate. The elevator carried me up. Coworkers asked about deadlines and meetings. No one knew that the same access logs they used to track productivity had just dismantled a lie built by two people who assumed I wouldn't know how to fight back. At lunch, an email arrived from our security office. Affidavits prepared, logs and footage preserved. Let us know if the court or district attorney requests certified copies. I replied with a simple thank you and saved it. By the end of the week, the consequences began to ripple outward. Quietly, methodically. The recorder's office confirmed the disputed deed was now formally flagged pending investigation. The notary's commission status shifted to under review. The sheriff's civil unit updated their system so no future enforcement action tied to that address could proceed without additional verification. Doors were closing. My parents' attorney sent one final letter. The tone was different this time. Careful, restrained, expensive. It suggested mediation to avoid further escalation and proposed a neutral location. I didn't respond. Escalation implies two sides pushing. I wasn't pushing anymore. I was standing still while the system finished what it had started. On Friday evening, I walked through the house room by room, not inspecting for damage, not checking windows. Reacquainting. The hallway where my grandfather once measured my height. The back door that stuck in summer. The corner of the living room where the light always softened just before sunset. Objects remember things people try to overwrite. I stopped in the living room and sat on the floor, my back against the couch. For the first time since the knock, I let my shoulders drop without checking myself. Not relief. Something steadier. Alignment. There's a moment after conflict where you wait for something else to happen. Another message? Another attempt? It didn't come. What came instead was quiet. Earned, not borrowed. Before bed, I installed a small camera by the porch. Not hidden. Visible. A statement without words. Then I wrote everything down. Not for court. Not for anyone else. For me. Memory fades. Paper doesn't. If you're listening to this and wondering what it feels like when the fight pauses, this is it. Not victory. Not peace. Awareness. When people rush you, it's because they're afraid of time. When they guilt you, it's because they're afraid of records. And when they ask you to keep things in the family, it's usually because the facts won't survive outside the room. I didn't win by being louder. I won by being precise. And the quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was the sound of control returning. One locked door, one saved message, one unarguable fact at a time. The quiet didn't mean it was over. It meant the shape of the fight had changed. 3 days after the locks were replaced, a certified envelope appeared in my mailbox. No return address on the front. Inside was a letter from my parents' attorney. Short, careful, and polished, until it almost sounded reasonable. It spoke about misunderstandings, about family relationships, about the wisdom of resolving matters privately before they became unnecessarily public. I read it once. Then I placed it in the folder without responding. Silence had already proven more effective than explanation. That afternoon, my phone rang again. This time, the number wasn't blocked. It was my father's. I watched it ring until it stopped. A voicemail followed. "Claire," he said, voice low and measured. "You've embarrassed people. You're forcing us into positions we don't want to be in. This isn't finished." I listened to the message all the way through, then saved it with the date and time. No commentary, no emotion, just placement. That evening, a car parked across the street and stayed there longer than necessary. Engine off, lights dark. Not parked for convenience, parked to be seen. I watched from the kitchen window without turning off the lights inside. Visibility works both ways. After several minutes, the car drove away. The next morning, I went back to the courthouse. Not because I was required to, but because momentum only works if you keep it moving. I filed a request for a temporary restraining order, attaching the voicemail, the earlier text message, and a short declaration outlining the pattern of contact since the ruling. No adjectives, No speculation. Just dates, times, and quotes. The clerk skimmed the filing, then looked up at me. "You've already built a strong record," she said. "I'd like to keep it clean," I replied. She nodded and stamped the paperwork. A hearing date was set for the following week. On my way out, I stopped by the recorder's office again. The same clerk recognized me immediately. "The fraud alert is still active," she said. "Any new filings will trigger manual review." "Has anyone tried?" I asked. She hesitated. "Someone called yesterday asking about the parcel. We didn't release anything." I didn't ask who. The answer wouldn't change what I needed to do next. Back home, I updated every account connected to the house: utilities, insurance, tax portal, adding notes that no changes were authorized without my written approval. Institutions move slowly, but once they're warned, they remember. By late afternoon, my parents returned. This time, they didn't stay in the car. My mother stood on the sidewalk, smoothing her sleeves as if she were about to knock on a neighbor's door. My father stayed half a step behind her, close enough to support, far enough to let her lead. "We need to talk," she called out. I didn't open the door. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke through the wood, the porch camera recording, the timestamp blinking steadily. "There's nothing to discuss," I said. "Communication goes through attorneys now." "You're taking this too far," she replied. "We're still your parents." "You stopped being that when you filed forged papers in court," I said. "Everything after that is procedure." My father stepped forward. "You think a judge is going to protect you forever?" "I think records do," I said. For a moment, no one spoke. Cars passed at the end of the street. Somewhere, a dog barked. Ordinary life continued around a conversation that had already lost its power. "We'll be in touch," my mother said finally. "I'm sure you will," I replied. They left without another word. That night, an email arrived from the court confirming the restraining order hearing date. I printed it, added it to the folder, and placed the folder back in the pouch. The stack was getting thick now, heavy enough that it didn't bend when I lifted it. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished pretending this was a misunderstanding. There's a point where you realize the danger isn't losing, it's delaying the inevitable while hoping people will suddenly choose differently. My parents weren't going to change. The system didn't need them to. It only needed consistency. Before bed, I walked the perimeter of the house, checking doors and windows. Not anxiously, just thoroughly. When I turned off the lights, the porch camera blinked once, steady and visible. If you're listening to this, understand what Part 7 really is. It's the moment after court, when people try to regain control through proximity and pressure instead of paper. It's where most stories fall apart because someone agrees to just talk. I didn't. I let the distance widen, I let the record grow, and I let the system do what it does best when you stop feeding it noise. Because once the lies are exposed, the only thing left for liars to test is whether you'll blink. I didn't. The restraining order hearing was set for Monday morning. Not urgent enough to feel dramatic, but close enough that every day leading up to it carried weight. That space, between action and consequence, is where most people unravel. I didn't let myself. Over the weekend, I prepared the way I had learned to, quietly, methodically, without emotion. I reviewed every document again, not to memorize them, but to understand the order in which they told the truth. Sequence turns claims into evidence. I numbered the pages, added a simple index. No adjectives, no conclusions. Just facts arranged so they could speak for themselves. On Sunday night, another email arrived from my mother. "You're tearing the family apart. Your grandfather would be ashamed." I stared at the words longer than I wanted to, not because they hurt, but because they were familiar. Guilt dressed as concern. Memory repurposed as leverage. I saved the email, forwarded it to myself, and labeled it post-ruling contact. Then I closed the laptop and went to bed. Sleep came in fragments. The courthouse on Monday felt calmer than it had the first time I'd rushed through its doors. I arrived early and sat on the same bench outside Department 12, my folder on my lap. When my parents entered with their attorney, they didn't sit near me. Distance had become the new rule. Judge Watkins took the bench and went straight to the point. "This is a request for a temporary restraining order based on post-judgment contact," she said. "Ms. Holloway, you may proceed." I stood, handed the clerk my packet, and spoke only when asked. Dates, times, messages, the voicemail, the text, the email. I didn't speculate about motives. I didn't assign emotions. I let the record do the talking. When it was my parents' turn, their attorney framed it as concern, as confusion, as an attempt to repair relationships. The language was soft, the posture respectful. Judge Watkins listened without interrupting. Then she asked one question. "Why did you continue contacting the defendant after this court issued a stay and dismissed your case?" There was no clean answer to that. The order was brief. Limited contact. No approaching the property. Communication through counsel only. Temporary. Pending further proceedings. I didn't smile when it was issued. Smiling makes people think you're enjoying something you're just securing. Outside the courtroom, my mother tried once more. "This is extreme," she said, voice low. "We're still your parents." I stopped walking, turned just enough to meet her eyes. "You stopped being that when you tried to take my house with forged paper," I said. "Everything after that is procedure." I didn't wait for her response. Back home, the shift was immediate, not dramatic, subtle, like a room that's been aired out after something sour has been removed. The house didn't feel triumphant, it felt stable. That afternoon, the county recorder emailed confirmation. The quitclaim deed was formally flagged as disputed, pending investigation. Any future attempt to record documents against the parcel would trigger additional verification and notice. An hour later, a call from my employer's legal department. They had prepared affidavits authenticating the badge logs and footage. If the district attorney requested them, they were ready. I thanked them, filed the documents, closed the laptop. As evening fell, I sat on the front steps and watched the street settle into routine. Kids on bikes, a couple walking their dog, no parked cars watching my house, no shadows pretending not to be shadows. For the first time since the knock at dawn, I let myself think beyond defense. What comes after survival? After proof? After winning something you never asked to fight for? The answer wasn't revenge. It wasn't reconciliation either. It was clarity. If you're listening to this, understand something. Systems don't protect people who hesitate. They protect people who document. Every message you don't answer but save. Every date you write down. Every boundary you keep because you know it will matter later. My parents thought pressure would make me fold. Instead, it made the record thicker. And records have a way of outlasting intentions. By the time I locked the door that night, the house felt fully mine again, not because no one could take it, but because anyone who tried would have to walk through a trail of evidence that didn't care who they were. Tomorrow there would be consequences, and for once, they wouldn't be mine. The call came 2 weeks later on a Tuesday afternoon that looked exactly like every other one. That's how consequences usually arrive, without warning, without ceremony, slipping into ordinary hours as if they belong there. "Ms. Holloway," the woman said when I answered. "This is the district attorney's office." I closed my laptop before she finished the sentence. Some habits don't need explanation. "We've reviewed the referral from Judge Watkins regarding the quitclaim deed and the notary," she continued. "We're opening a formal investigation. We'll need certified copies of your documents and a brief written statement." "I have everything," I said. "I expected you would," she replied, and there was no warmth or judgment in her voice, only confirmation. After the call ended, I didn't sit down. I stood in the kitchen, looking at the folder on the table, the one that had grown heavier with every attempt to rush me into silence. Investigation wasn't a pause or a warning, it was a direction. And once things start moving that way, they don't reverse themselves politely. By the end of the week, letters went out. Not to me, but to my parents, their attorney, and the notary. requests for records, requests for communications, instructions to preserve journals, emails, intake logs. The paper trail they believed no one would ever follow was about to be walked, step by step. The notary was the first to break. I didn't hear it from her. I heard it from the investigator assigned to the case, in a voicemail left while I was at work. "She's cooperating," the message said. "She's turned over her journal, phone records, and correspondence." Correspondence. I replayed that word once, then saved the message. 2 days later, my father called. Not from a blocked number, from his own. I watched the phone ring until it stopped. A text followed. "We need to talk. This has gone too far." I turned the phone face down on the table. Far was a line he'd crossed weeks ago. Everything after that was distance catching up. That evening, another email arrived. This one from my parents' attorney. The tone had changed. Gone was the smooth confidence. In its place, careful language about potential exposure and a suggestion to resolve all outstanding matters, quietly. Quietly, as if quiet were something they had ever offered me. I didn't respond. On Friday morning, the county recorder updated the parcel record. The disputed deed was now marked subject to investigation, a public notice. Anyone who searched the property would see it immediately. The house wasn't just protected anymore. It was annotated. That afternoon, my mother sent one final email. "We raised you better than this." I read it once, then forwarded it to the investigator handling the case without comment. Let the sentence introduce itself. The silence that followed wasn't strategic. It was retreat. Weeks passed. The street stayed empty. No parked cars. No accidental run-ins. The restraining order was extended without objection. The notary's commission status changed to suspended pending outcome. Her name disappeared from the public registry not long after. One morning, the investigator called again. "There will be charges," she said. "Forgery, filing a false instrument, conspiracy." She paused. "Your documentation made this straightforward." After the call, I walked through the house, not to check locks or windows, but to remind myself where I was standing. The doorway my grandfather fixed after the storm. The shelf he insisted was level even when it wasn't. Places that existed long before lies were filed against them. When people imagine justice, they picture a moment, a sentence, a reaction. What it actually looks like is paperwork moving forward without you having to push it anymore. That night, I received a docket alert. My parents' attorney had filed a motion to withdraw as counsel. I read it twice, closed the browser. A few days later, a plain envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a handwritten note in my mother's tight, unmistakable script. "I hope you're happy." I folded it once and placed it in the folder. No response. Some statements don't need context to be understood. By now, the folder was thick enough that it didn't bend when I lifted it. Heavy enough to remind me that truth has mass. If you're listening to this and expecting some kind of emotional release, there wasn't one. What I felt instead was alignment between what happened and what was recorded, between who tried to erase me and who failed. People think the hardest part is standing up to someone you love. It's not. The hardest part is refusing to soften the record for their comfort. By the time the district attorney finalized the charges, there was nothing left for me to say. I'd already said everything that mattered, without raising my voice once. The system didn't take my side because I was right. It took my side because the truth was documented, time-stamped, and impossible to look away from. Part 10 was coming, not as a fight, as an ending. The final order arrived on a Wednesday morning, folded neatly inside a plain envelope, like it didn't understand the weight it carried. I recognized the seal before I opened it. Some things announce themselves quietly because they don't need emphasis. The charges were filed. The fraudulent deed was voided. The recorder updated the parcel record permanently, restoring the chain of title to exactly where it had always belonged. My name, my grandfather's intent, no footnotes. I set the letter down on the kitchen table and stood there longer than necessary, letting the stillness settle without trying to label it. It wasn't relief. It wasn't triumph. It was something steadier. Finality. the kind that doesn't rush in, but closes behind you once you've already stepped through. Later that afternoon, I went back to the county recorder's office one last time. The clerk printed the updated record summary and slid it across the counter. She didn't smile. She didn't congratulate me. She didn't need to. "Everything's clean now," she said. I nodded. "Thank you." On the drive home, I passed the courthouse without looking at it. Buildings like that don't need acknowledgement once they've done their job. They exist whether you watch them or not. The house was quiet when I walked in. Sunlight stretched across the living room floor in the same way it always had, as if nothing extraordinary had tried to pass through it. I sat down on the floor, back against the couch, and stayed there for a while, not thinking about what almost happened, but about what didn't. My parents never contacted me again. Not directly. Not indirectly. Their attorney didn't either. Silence, this time, wasn't tactical. It was acceptance. The kind that arrives when there's nothing left to threaten with. A month later, the district attorney's office confirmed what I already knew. The case was moving forward without my involvement. They didn't need me anymore. The evidence could stand on its own. That was the real ending. Not a confrontation, not an apology. Independence from the story itself. I didn't change much after that. I kept the porch camera. I kept the folder. I kept certified copies of the orders in the same fireproof pouch. Not because I expected trouble, but because reality doesn't erase itself just because you'd like it to. One evening, I stood in the doorway and watched the street settle into dusk. The same houses, the same sidewalks. No parked cars watching my windows. No footsteps pausing where they didn't belong. Just ordinary life continuing, indifferent to the drama that had tried to attach itself here. That's how you know something is over. People like to imagine justice as a moment, loud, visible, unmistakable. But most of the time, justice is administrative, its forms processed, records corrected, doors that no longer open when someone tries the old handle. I didn't win because I was stronger. I didn't win because I was louder. I won because I was methodical, because I wrote things down when it would have been easier to argue, because I saved messages instead of answering them, because I trusted timestamps more than promises. Some stories end with reconciliation, some end with revenge. This one ended with boundaries that held. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and let the house settle around me. Not as a prize, not as a battlefield, but as what it had always been meant to be. Home. And if stories like this stay with you, the ones where silence becomes strategy, where patience outlasts pressure, where the record speaks louder than manipulation, then you already understand why they matter. They remind us that calm isn't weakness, that documentation is power, and that sometimes the quietest endings are the strongest ones. I went to bed that night without checking the locks twice, without replaying conversations, without waiting for the next knock. If another story like this ever needs telling, you'll recognize it the same way I did, by how early it tries to wake you.